Good afternoon and good evening and good morning. My name is Matthew Baird. I'm the director of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, and I'd like to welcome you to this important webinar on defending the defenders. You can see in the conference background, I can also do some promotional work for the second ASEAN Environmental Law Conference, which is coming up in 2 weeks' time. And we'll be sharing the link for registration. It's a free event over 3 days. Taking into account a number of environmental law issues. And session 1 is also going to be examining our topic today, which is on environmental and human rights defenders. The issue about environmental and human rights defenders is tragically one that is ongoing and has not yet seen any reduction as a consequence of some of the issues happening with COVID. Environmental defenders and environmental human rights defenders still face so many challenges in enhancing and protecting the environment and standing up for human rights. It's been recognized that as the environmental or the human right to a clean environment also encompasses the important role that people play, everyday people play in protecting the environment, supporting human rights, and that in and of itself must be protected. So today we're looking at the role of those environmental and human rights defenders, and this is a continuing series on an issue that we continue to ensure that we raise it and we look at solutions and ideas and the challenges that are ongoing. And so today we brought together 3 very, very distinguished speakers. And our first speaker, who will start the presentation shortly, is Ramchat Ratanakonkul, who is the National Human Rights Officer on Climate Change and Human Rights. She's been working as the regional focal point on climate change and environment for the UN Human Rights Regional Office for Southeast Asia since 2019. Previously, she served as the National Human Rights Commissioner of Thailand, as the Human Rights Officer and Investigative Officer of the Human Rights Protection Bureau, focusing on economic, social and cultural rights and business and human rights. So Kun Ramchat, it's a great pleasure to have you with us here today, and the screen and the floor are now yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew, for having me joining this very important session and webinar on defending the defenders. And this is really timely in parallel of what is going on in the Human Rights Council session, the regular session number 49, regular session at the Human Rights Council, which is taking place in Geneva, Switzerland at this moment. And the question I have from Matthew is to present the outcomes of the high-level side event on environmental human rights defenders as the Human Rights Council session. But before we listen about the outcome, I think it would worth mentioning to provide the brief introduction of the Human Rights Council for those who is not really familiar with these UN mechanisms. So clearly I am myself not the defenders, but I am here to introduce you and share with you the mechanisms that support the work of environmental human rights defenders under the UN mechanism system. So the Human Rights Council, which is the principal intergovernmental body within the UN system and responsible for strengthening the promotion and protection of human rights around the world and for addressing and taking action of human rights violations around the world. And many of you have been working really closely with the subsidiaries bodies of the councils, for example, the Universal Periodic Review or the special procedures, for example, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, or the special rapporteurs on human rights and environment, or even the special rapporteurs on the situation of human rights defenders. So they are the subsidiaries body of the Human Rights Council. And the councils hold meetings throughout the year, providing a multilateral forum to address human rights violations wherever and whenever they occur. it responds to the human rights emergencies and makes recommendations on how to better implement human rights on the ground. And the Council has the ability to discuss all thematic human rights issues, including human rights defenders and environmental or climate change issue, and also discuss the country-specific situation that require its attention. Of course, during this regularization, the countries in discussion is Ukraine, so that is how the Human Rights Council work. And for the regularization, the Human Rights Council meets 3 times a year, or around 10 weeks per year at the office in Geneva, Switzerland. And the regularization often take place in March, June, and September. So at this moment, the council is meeting now in Geneva and will last until the 1st of April. And the really exciting development in this regularization is the appointment of the new special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. And the outcome, the main output of these Human Rights Council regularization are resolutions and government statement. And the Council can, further to the regularization, the Council can also convene the urgent meeting on short notice to respond to on emerging human rights crisis. For example, last year, the Council held the urgent meeting on Myanmar. So that is the example of the urgent meetings. Apart from, I will skip the members country of the Human Rights Council at this moment, but you can see from the screen. And I just show the current member from Asia Pacific, which is now the part of 13 members among 47 members council. And the council membership is based on equitable geographical distribution of seats according to this regional breakdown. But in addition to the member states of the council, observers, which include non-member states, intergovernmental organizations, national human rights institutions, and non-governmental organizations, always and also participate actively in the council sessions. They can organize the side event or parallel activities during the Human Rights Council session as well. But what I really would like to share at this webinar is the Human Rights Council resolution on environmental human rights defenders, which is a very important tool and a very important product from the Human Rights Council meeting. The Human Rights Council resolution text that clearly present the position of the Council's member, or the majority of them, on particular human rights issues and situations. Resolution focus on country-specific or thematic human rights issue as well, and they can lead to actions that help address these issues. But the Human Rights Council's resolution and decision are not legally binding. However, they do contain a very strong political commitment. And in 2019, this is the first time that the Human Rights Council adopt the landmark resolution, adopt the vote. The resolution number 4011, recognizing the contribution of environmental human rights defenders to the enjoyment of human rights, environmental protection, and sustainable development. And the resolution was led by and presented by Norway on behalf of 60 states from all regions. And the key points of this resolution is, for the first time, the Council recognized the positive and important and legitimate role of environmental human rights defenders, and also expressed their concern about the situation of environmental human rights defenders, that they are among the defenders most exposed and at risk. They also recognized the protection of human rights defenders that can be achieved through the approach which promote and celebrate the work of environmental human rights defenders. The resolution also calls for root cause of violation to be addressed by strengthening democratic institutions, combating impunity, and reducing economic inequalities. In this resolution, which I will share the link with you later to the full text of the resolution, also laid a lot of text and recommendation for the government and business as well. But one key point for the government, the resolution urged the government to adopt laws guaranteeing the protection of defenders, put in place holistic protection measures for and in consultation with defenders, and ensure investigation, accountability for threat and attack against environmental human rights defenders, and also acknowledge the role of the business sector to carry out the human rights due diligence and hold meaningful, inclusive consultation with defenders or potential effect group and other relevant stakeholders. After the resolution in 2019, there are some development in the international level. In 2020, some group of defenders met in Geneva in February and organized the group called Resolution 4011 Milestone to discuss, brainstorm the implementation of this Human Rights Council resolution. And last year, during the Human Rights Council session in March, with the sponsor from Norway, they also organized the meeting to discuss the opportunity for the better protection of environmental human rights defenders. But for this year, as you can see from my screen, what is just happening in this regular session just 2 weeks ago. This is the first time that the OSCHR and the government of Sweden co-organized the high-level side event at the Human Rights Council session. The reason we call the high-level event because we invite the high-level policy makers, for example, the Ministry of Sweden, Costa Rica, to reconfirm the international community's commitment to defend and support environmental human rights defenders. And we would like to increase the understanding and awareness about the ongoing dangerous circumstance which the EHRDs undertake their work. And the concrete outcome is to inspire the joint statement of the government to present at the Human Rights Council for on the environmental human rights defenders. Just a few quote from the side event which already took place on the 9th of March. The UN High Commissioner is, as you can see from the screen, the High Commissioner quote that the protecting the environment goes hand in hand with protecting the rights of those who defend it. Their voice must be heard and protected, and we must have zero tolerance for killings or threats and attacks against them. As I already mentioned, we also have the Minister of Sweden and Costa Rica as well, but not only the representative of the government. We also have Joanne Carlin from our region to represent the voice and her first-hand experience of the work of environmental human rights defenders and the threat that they have been experienced. In her presentation, she shared the experience of the young sons of her colleagues who asked her, "Did my father do something wrong? Why was he killed? I wish someone could explain to him why doing the right thing and defending his land is a death warrant." So that was happening during the Human Rights Council side event session on environmental human rights defenders. But what is the concrete outcome of that human rights defenders? On the 16th of March, Sweden, on behalf of Costa Rica, the USA, and all over 60 countries, which I will share the list of the country later, deliver the joint statement, and they call on all states to protect the rights of environmental human rights defenders, including the right to freedom of expression and to seek, receive, and impart information, and their abilities to participate freely without fear or reprisal, and to effectively implement the procedural rights under national laws addressed in Rio Plus 10. The joint statement of the government also call on government to ensure access to justice in environmental matters, to protect the defenders, and to ensure their safety, and to acknowledge and address the specific threats to women, indigenous, Afro-descendant, and other minority environmental human rights defenders, whether the threat call from state and non-state actors. They also record a step on the resolution 4011 that I already mentioned and reiterate the Council's call to implement them without delay, also recognizing the latest Human Rights Council resolution on the right to the safe, clean, healthy, and the healthy environment, and the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. And the government who signed its joint statement commit to continue working together to find effective ways to defend and support environmental human rights defenders. So you might have a question, what is happening in Geneva? What is the impact for the defenders in the region? At the Human Rights Council, government can make statements that express a position, particular on human rights issue or human rights situation in another country, and a statement which I just share with you can be delivered by the several government as a joint statement, and as well as similar to the Human Rights Council. They are not legally binding and they are not strong as a resolution, and because they do not have the authority to request the UN to take action or contribute resources, but they pay a way of getting the Human Rights Council to pay attention to issues that are not on the agenda, and often a necessary step for further action by the UN. The 60 countries, which I mentioned in the previous slide, I am trying to find the country, at least from Asia region, in the yellow highlight, especially the countries who support this joint statement from Southeast Asia country. And I cannot see any. So it means we still have a lot of work to do in the region. I don't want to end on the negative note, but yeah, that's why the webinar today is really important. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ramjat, for that. And I think, you know, the exciting thing is that there are these international forum at the Human Rights Council that we don't often hear about. We don't often understand that the resolutions that they make and the idea of where countries can identify their support of an issue actually do then follow up with sort of resolutions or treaties. A month ago with our webinar, we held our webinar on plastics just before the UN Environment Assembly resolved to actually have an international treaty on plastic waste. I was also very interested that in terms of that protection or that statement, it also included some of those important procedural rights that we've seen certainly in recent times in Latin America and the Caribbean on the Escazú Agreement. Not only identifying the important role that environmental human rights defenders play, but how to protect them to enable them to keep doing their and exercising their human rights. So thank you so much indeed for that presentation. We're now moving sort of closer to Southeast Asia, and with the next speaker is Nick Bull, who's the Defenders Program Manager of EarthRights International. So he's worked closely with human rights defenders across Southeast Asia to provide emergency assistance to individuals at risk, conduct human rights research, undertake advocacy, and deliver capacity building initiatives. He's previously worked at the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development, Forum Asia, and Amnesty International's International Secretariat. EarthRights International has always been a great supporter of the webinars that Ariel has put on, and Nick is no stranger to presenting in these forums. So thank you very much, Nick, and the screen and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Matthew, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I hope you can see my screen. So today I'm just going to give a bit of an overview of the work that we undertake at EarthRights International. I will also be focusing on the strategy that we are currently implementing as part of our organizational strategy to protect Earthrights defenders. So to give you a little background about EarthRights, so we are a non-governmental, non-profit organization, and we focus on combining the power of the law and the power of the people in defense of human rights and the environment. And that is what we refer to as EarthRights. So our specialities include fact-finding, legal actions against perpetrators of abuses, training grassroots and community leaders, and advocacy and campaigns. So what we're actually made up of a number of grassroots activists, human rights investigators, trainers, lawyers, and campaigners. We came together in 1995 to start EarthRights International, and it began with a landmark case in the US over human rights abuses abroad. A bit of a background to that is two multinational oil companies in the 1990s, Unocal and Total, formed partnership with the Myanmar military, ruling military at that stage. And they planned to exploit natural gas reserves, and it resulted in human rights violations, including forced labor, land grabs, torture, and other different attacks on indigenous and ethnic minority people. We were born in response to that, where our founders actually trained a team of local investigators who investigated the testimonies of people who had experienced or witnessed the rights abuses directly connected to the pipeline, and also to the foreign companies that were building it. And it was actually a number of years ago now, a groundbreaking lawsuit in the US, a judge granted jurisdiction over a private company for human rights abuses abroad. And since then, EarthRights has been developing and supporting defenders within the country. So where we work, as mentioned, we work in the Mekong region of Southeast Asia. As Southeast Asia continues to renew interest in coal and continues to build destructive dams along the Mekong River, and the livelihoods of people are often affected. We also work in the Amazon region, so supporting defenders against extractive companies and other large corporations posing a threat to those in the region. Our head office is based in the United States, and we also look to address the safe haven for corporate human rights abuses there. So what we actually focus on is justice, climate justice, and accountability. So fossil fuel companies and governments being held increasingly accountable for climate-related damages to communities and for respecting communities' rights. We also focus on corporate accountability, the legal and social accountability of corporations for respecting community rights, including to land and a healthy environment. But the one I'll be speaking to you about today and our strategy on this is particularly on EarthRights defenders, so land and environmental rights defenders, specifically on the criminalization and attacks against defenders, and seeing that they are reduced and legal protections are strengthened in countries where we work. So the way we try to do this is through a few different areas. We try to build global and local collaboration and participate within that. We develop strong lawyers networks and try to improve laws to protect defenders. But also one of the main things is we try to capacitate and train community leaders and environmental defenders at the grassroots level so that they have the knowledge and skills to protect themselves and their communities. So as I mentioned, we focus on a few areas: training. We undertake campaigns as well to expose abuses against EarthRights defenders and communities affected. But when all else fails, we do take perpetrators to court, and we try to actually support legal action to protect defenders and communities affected. So specifically what I'll be talking about for the next few minutes is our global protection strategy. So what that actually is a strategy based on the recognition that EarthRights defenders are advocates, organizers, trainers, educators, and connectors for defending communities. And they're often the last line of defense between communities that seek to ensure that their resources and livelihoods are not affected. But as Ramchat shared earlier, and as I'm sure everyone watching this will know, defenders are often subjected to attacks and threats for their work, and often excluded from decision-making processes. So in recognition of that, we undertake a strategy which focuses on a few different areas. So this looks at protecting, addressing immediate threats to defenders, preventing, trying to address the structural issues that cause threats, including the shrinking of civil space and indigenous rights, but also revealing to shine a light on collusion and corruption, and also obtaining justice for victims by holding the perpetrators accountable. So we try to undertake the strategy, and I'll go through these in a little bit more detail, looking at trying to develop the knowledge, tools, and resources to stay safe, actually using the courts and the legal systems to support defenders, but also ensuring that anti-corruption laws are being used and greater revenue transparency is being undertaken. So what we mean when we say protect is we train EarthRights defenders. So we have something called our EarthRights School, which exists with the intention to equip civil society advocates from the Mekong region with the knowledge, skills, and experience on how to support communities. And that integrates over a number of months, campaign, storytelling, legal advocacy strategies, and also a focus on security as well. We also try to build cross-regional linkages among defenders and their supporters. So the EarthRights School, as well as other initiatives, including legal networks, act as a hub for strategic organizing, movement building, and leadership development within the region. It also gives the opportunity for defenders to connect with each other, but also, and I emphasize this as well, the opportunity to step back from the daily stress of work and to rest and reflect in a safe space. So another aspect of our strategy is using national litigation and local legal strategies to defend defenders. So that includes supporting, trying to strengthen national litigation and local legal strategies to both defend individual defenders, but also communities affected. We also support efforts to recognise and protect defenders by trying with safeguarding policies. So we work with others to try and ensure adherence to principles like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We also focus as one of our key goals, as I mentioned earlier, efforts to rein in corporate power, strengthen accountability and transparency, so that corporations respect human rights, the environment, but also recognise the importance and legitimacy of defenders. We also try to encourage ending ties between corporations and police or paramilitaries. In the Amazon region, for example, we, along with local partners, have taken action on contracts, legal action on contracts between mining companies and collusion with national police. We're trying to bring transparency to the arrangements that exist. But in terms of prevent, we're looking at addressing structural issues, including to prevent the shrinking of civil space. So we fight new coal and oil development. So we recognise that defenders on the ground are leading the fight, and they are often communities or individuals that are facing exploitation. So we support their work, we support their efforts, and we also provide advice and guidance on processes like the environmental impact assessment and in relation to security. In addition to fighting coal and oil developments, we also feel there's an urgent need to campaign for structural change so that financial institutions, banks and other funds seize their support for fossil fuel projects and projects linked to abuses and land grab. With that in mind, we also focus on IFIs along as potential sources of finance, with an understanding that should financial support cease, it will mean that the exploitative projects and actions will also hopefully cease as well. We also try to encourage and strengthen free, prior and informed consent, as a lack of that is obviously an underlying issues. EIAs are often not adhered to, communities are often unaware or unfamiliar with them, so we actually try to support that. We also support the corporations, we also support the fighting of slap suits, which are a key tactic against defenders. And importantly, we use the global human rights regime to keep defenders safe and to bring attention to their special situations and also the structural issues they face. The other part of our strategy is about shining a light on collusion and corruption. That includes enforcing global anti-corruption laws and policies in the natural resource sector to build and grow global awareness of connection and corruption. But also to effectively call for effectively implementing and monitoring controls, promoting transparency along supply chains as well. So looking at funding sources and resource supply chains and exposing them when they actually affect communities and result in human rights violations. And also something that we also focus on is revenue transparency, particularly recognizing that there's often a lack of transparency, opaque decision-making processes, and there's often collusion between corporations and governments. So we work with others and partners in what we actually look at following the money. Where do the revenue streams come from? And the last part of our strategy is about redress. So obtaining justice and redress for victims. So as I mentioned before, we've tried to do that using the power of law and litigation to defend defenders and support communities affected. But also we recognize that transnational litigation is one means of holding perpetrators accountable. We also try to strengthen the global legal protections for defenders and challenge impunity as well. Recognizing that global legal protections for defenders must be strengthened, as well as global accountability mechanisms. So there are two relevant US statutes which have extraterritorial reach, which we've worked on previously, which include the Global Magnitsky Act and the Alien Tort Statute. And this is in relation to how we were founded as an organization. So some of the recent work we've been doing to try and actually implement this strategy, we've been training and supporting defenders as part of our school, including topics on climate change, security, communications, among many others. We increasingly provide emergency assistance advice and support to defenders that are at risk, to either directly so that we can actually give the advice and in situations where they are being targeted, or actually helping them obtain the financial support that they need. We've been looking at criminalization of defenders in different countries, country-specific and locally accessible guide on criminalization and judicial harassment of defenders in Cambodia is something we've been working on. As well as that, we've engaged with UN protection mechanisms and communications to influential actors on individual cases. That may include special procedures communications on defenders at risk. But we've also developed a security and protection toolkit, which will be made available on our website fairly soon. That's also in Thai language as well. Focusing on digital physical security, legal targeting, but with a strong focus on psychosocial well-being as well. Another aspect of our work was quite a large research project looking at the challenges and obstacles facing defenders in the region, which many of you may have been involved with. It was designed to give an opportunity for defenders to actually share their experiences, best practices, and what they believed could actually help them undertake their work in a more safe and secure manner. Okay, that's an overview of our work, the strategy that we are trying to implement within the region, but also internationally as well. And I look forward to any questions. Thank you for listening to me. Back to you, Matthew.
Thank you very much, Nick, and thank you for the overview. And if you're able to share any of those sort of website for EarthRights International and some of those toolkits, I think it's really interesting how adopting that multi-layered approach and different strategies is recognized as being very important. I can also say that there is a session 2 for our conference in 2 weeks' time that will be hosted by EarthRights International on public interest environmental law. And session 1 will be looking at more on environmental human rights defenders. And so we think these are really important and vital issues to keep talking about and keep acting on. And I can also send a big hello to some of our participants I see from India and Bangladesh and Germany, Philippines. So welcome all. Thank you very much for being with us today. So now we're going to move actually to the Philippines. Our next speaker, Leon Dulce, is the current national coordinator of the Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment, or Kalikasan PNE, which is a national grassroots-led environmental campaign centre established in 1997. He graduated with a BFA in Visual Communications degree from UP College of Fine Arts and has been applying creative strategies in environmental activism over the past 9 years. He is an alumnus of the International Mining for Development Centre, Mine, Waste, Landform Management and Closure Workshop in 2014, International Service for Human Rights Defender Advocacy Programs in 2018, and the UN Environment Workshop in Environmental Rights in 2019. He's represented Filipino environmental rights before the 2019 National Inquiry on Human Rights Defenders on the Human Rights Commission, on the Commission on Human Rights, and he has served as a resource speaker, training facilitator, lobby and advocacy campaigner in national and international forum, conferences and other gatherings related to environmental justice and environmental defender rights in 2013. He has written extensively opinion pieces and features on environment, climate and human rights topics for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, Rappler, Manila Today and Bulatatlat. So I can really welcome Leon here to present today, and recognizing, of course, that the Philippines is still one of the most dangerous places for environmental and human rights defenders. And as the Philippines goes into its national elections, it's probably something worth remembering that this is a really important and all too very, very powerful and relevant message for people in the Philippines today. So Leon, please, the screen and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon to everyone. So let me just share my presentation slides in a while. Okay, so I think the Philippines as a case study is actually a powerful testament to what you have heard from our previous speakers, and really is a strong clarion call for international action on the rights and plight of environmental defenders, not only in Asia, but everywhere as well. So we're going to zoom into the Philippine situation, where, the plight of Filipino environmental defenders. Just a quick introduction that I represent the Kalikasan. It's a national environmental campaign center. It was founded by grassroots federations such as indigenous peoples networks, farmers associations, trade unions, and other marginalized sectors that have common environmental concerns. So even before we knew that we were environmental defenders, we were already composed or comprised of environmental defenders doing the work since 1997. So just to start, maybe we could look at the global context and look at why we, the Philippines and Southeast Asia more broadly is actually an important hotspot. And we can take the cue from the most recent Global Witness report on land and environmental defender killing. So we'll just look at quickly at the global overview and then zoom into the Philippines afterwards. So first, the previous year's report actually showed that, and this is a continuing trend in the Global Witness reports. By the way, we are one of the main partners of Global Witness in documenting and reporting killings of environmental defenders here in the Philippines. And year on year, the years keep getting worse. And last year's report said that the 2020 was the worst on record, in the 10 years that Global Witness has been documenting killings. 227 land and environmental defenders across the world were killed, and this averages with more than 4 people a week, being killed on across the world. This situation is just the bloody tipping point, if you will, or tip of the problem. It represents a broader situation where land and environmental defenders are facing various other human rights violations, including illegal arrests, smear campaigns. For instance, in the Philippines, the trend of red tagging or tagging environmental defenders as enemies of the state or as terrorists, non-lethal attacks such as harassment, threats, intimidations, physical assault, and of course, lethal attacks as well, no? Extrajudicial killings, and especially for environmental defenders who are more apt to collectively operate, no, as working together across territories or landscapes, widespread and massive militarization of their communities and territories. No? So it all results into an extremely restricted civic space that we are facing, and the killings are just the tip of the iceberg. The findings also showed that the climate crisis and the crisis of human rights and social injustice are interlinked, no? Across the globe. As the climate crisis worsens, so does the situation of land and environmental defenders. As the conflict for resource consumption and the conflict for between defenders trying to give breathing space to our Mother Earth, and big businesses and governments trying to maintain business as usual, that situation of conflict fuels more increasing violence against people defending lands and territories and environments. No? And this is especially the case in countries in Southeast Asia, such as and the rest of the global South. So this is very true in our region as well. When you zoom into some relevant data in the Global Witness Report about the Philippines, it shows that really nothing has changed in the past decade or so, and situation has actually worsened. No? In the last report, 29 land and environmental defenders in the Philippines were monitored, and this was the highest number in a single country outside of the Americas, now, particularly Latin America. So the Philippines indeed remains one of the deadliest countries for defenders across the world. So we are currently the third deadliest in the world, the first being Colombia and the second being Mexico. But for the past 8 years, the Philippines has remained the deadliest country in Asia. One of the highlights in the report was also the increasing number of massacres. No? So mass-scale killings, no? Not just targeted killings. No? So this actually was disproportionately demonstrated in the situation of indigenous peoples. Now, indigenous peoples are increasingly targeted with wide-scale violence, no, massacres. No? And one of the most shocking cases was just before the turn of the year, in December 30, 2020, when 9 indigenous Tumandok people were killed in a concerted operation by police and military forces in one of the islands of central Philippines, no? In the island of Panay. So this is a recurring situation, especially by rural communities who are up against land and environment, natural resource grabbing in the Philippines. So now we zoom into the national situation, the broader situation in the Philippines. We have started recording cases since 2001, and at the present, our tabulated data points to at least 301 cases of land and environmental defenders being killed here in the Philippines, now up to 2020. So as you can see, it's increasingly spiking since 2001. When you look at the earlier spikes, no, in 2005, 2006, and then 2011, 2012, these actually were pivot years where particular mining revitalization policies were implemented by the past administrations. And so you will see later the recurring trend of mining being one of the main drivers of violence and conflict among land environmental defenders or against land environmental defenders. But starting in 2016 onwards, the spike was more of the indicator of the type of government that we have right now, the fascistic regime of President Rodrigo Duterte, who has really stepped up its so-called internal security policies. And later on, we'll delve into how this is actually feeding or being fed by economic, environment, natural resource policies as well in the Philippines. As I said before, the killings just represent is just a drop in the ocean of human rights violations. So for every one killing of land environmental defender in the Philippines, you have more than 100 other defenders who suffer various other abuses. No, so mainly in the Philippines, the large-scale displacement or forced evacuation of entire communities of defenders, such as indigenous tribes and farmer communities in the Philippines. And then you have other cases as well, like red tagging, legal arrests, and forced disappearances, and so on. So the number of affected defenders have really increased. No, compared to the previous administration, we are up to almost 5 times the number of environmental defenders affected by attacks and reprisals. If you look at the heat map, where in the Philippines, where the redder the province is, as indicated in the infographic, the more killings are recorded. It actually follows the contours of our mountain ranges here in the Philippines, because these are the last vestiges of our forest ecosystems, abundant with natural resources, but also particularly minerals and open spaces for infrastructure development. No? So if you will look at the southern part of the Philippines, it's one of the reddest spots. It's a mineral corridor, but also a biodiversity corridor in the island of Mindanao. At the leftmost island, you will see that's Palawan, globally known as the last ecological frontier in the Philippines, and full of unique flora and fauna, but also minerals as well. No? And the other island that you can see here in the central Philippines is Hacienda territory, no? Full of vast tracts of agricultural, agribusiness projects. No? So really where natural resources are, conflict can be found and killings can be found. The spread of drivers of these attacks and reprisals can be linked mainly to extractive projects. So if you look at the trends, it's mining that really drives a lot of the killings, the enforced disappearances, arrests, militarization, and red tagging, followed closely by agribusiness, by plantations, and logging. So really the extraction of natural resources is the main driver of attacks against people protecting their lands and their environment. No? Then when you look at what it means, no, what is at stake, you will see that the recorded number of environmental defenders killed through the years represent vast tracts of protected areas, vast tracts of ecologically critical areas in the Philippines. They represent 1.8 million hectares of seascapes, such as marine protected areas, mangrove ecosystems, and other coastal and marine ecosystems, and 4.4 million hectares of landscapes, especially the forested upland ecosystems here in the Philippines, and agricultural landscapes as well. And the victims comprise mainly of rural defenders, indigenous people, and farmers and agri-workers here in the Philippines. Together they've the record of martyred environmental defenders in the Philippines. They represent natural resources that we have valued to up to 1.03 trillion pesos a year, or more billions of dollars. No, it's hard to compute on the fly, but billions of dollars per year in terms of ecosystem values. No, so we tried to estimate what the forests, seascapes values are in terms of carbon sequestration, water regulation, production of non-timber forest resources, agriculture, health services, and disaster resilience. They really represent a lot of human needs, basic needs or fundamental needs that are usually not valued by corporations, no? Because these are often treated as not hard resources, because it translates into the air that we breathe, the water that we drink, the food that we eat, not necessarily hard monetary value for big businesses. And the perpetrators are mainly either confirmed as part of the state or suspected to be part of the state. We have a trend of assassinations here in the Philippines by riding in tandem hit squads, riding on motorcycles and doing targeted attacks. And the paper trail on that is extremely hard to identify. But a lot of cases as well are actually perpetrated by identified military battalions or police battalions, especially the massacres. No? So huge percentage of the killings are actually perpetrated by the state and benefiting big businesses. No? So that's also the difficulty when there is no direct accountability to corporations, because the ones implementing the attacks is the government, not the companies. No? So the general trends, no, reprisals, we noticed that a lot of attacks happen when environmental defenders become proactive in asserting their rights. No? When they start barricades, when they start direct actions, it really invites attacks to them. But there's also the proactive criminalization, no? the recognizing that environmental defenders are a powerful force in the protection of environment, but also a powerful force in opposing big business interests. Environmental defenders are systematically red tagged here in the Philippines, labeled as anti-development, labeled as terrorists, and this becomes justification for attacks, worse and worse attacks against them. And finally, the trend of the state providing violence as a form of investment guarantee, where you can see in the counterinsurgency programs here in the Philippines, internal security plans in the Philippines, they declare the mandate to attack communities because they have to provide so-called security to vital installations, infrastructure, critical investments, and these oftentimes are the big businesses. So I think I will end my presentation at that. Really a microcosm of the global situation environmental defenders face, and hopefully this inspires more action in improving our protections and recognitions of environmental defenders everywhere. Maraming salamat and thank you.
Salamat. Thank you very much, Leon, for that sobering presentation. So can I ask, we can have all of our panelists joining us for the questions. And so for our participants, please feel free to either type a Q&A or if you would in the Q&A box or in the chat box, or even if you would like to make a comment, please feel free to just click the raise hand button and the hand will come up and I'll be able to invite you to speak. So please feel free to if you want to make a comment or have a statement or type a question in the Q&A box, perhaps to think about some of these issues. And I thought, Leon, it was really powerful that there are these killings and more importantly the non-killing, the pressure, the violence, the dislocations, because of course there is a driver for this, which is often development and access to resources, but there's also the significant consequences, which are all of these ecosystem services are lost. We recognize that Indigenous people in particular are occupying and have managed and have preserved most of the environmental biodiversity that we need, that is keeping us alive as a planet, and they're the ones we are continuing to threaten. So I think that was an extraordinarily powerful presentation. I would also just like, Ramchad, if I could come back to you for a question in terms of the resolutions and the statements that come out of the Human Rights Council. Where do they go? We've had some people ask questions about the fact that there are a number of Southeast Asian and South Asian countries that are missing from signing up to that the most recent statement. what happens with those statements? Is there a way to ask governments in the region to sign up to those statements, or is it too late for that? Do we have to wait until the next statement comes out?
Thank you very much for your question, Matthew. I really would like to share more about the next step of this resolution and joint statement. It has been presented on 16th of March, and the reason I show the countries, the list of countries who support this joint statement, because I think it's really important for the defenders to work with the international communities, or even the embassies in the countries where there might be the funding or the business from those countries in our region. So you can see that which country is the champion who support or already expressed their standpoint on the issue of environmental human rights defenders. And the reason in my presentation, I show the call for action of that statement, because all of that countries already commit to protect the environmental human rights defenders. So I think that is one way the defenders can engage with those 62 countries who already signed up in this joint statement. And for the countries in the region who haven't really joined this statement, another way for the defenders or civil societies for the further resolution or Human Rights Council, we can continue working to convince or put pressure on your government, because in the Human Rights Council, there will be the representative of your government sitting in the Human Rights Council. So before the statement has draft, the member state will draft the text together, review this together, and it is the negotiation. So I believe this is the way the voice from our region, from your countries, can be presented to the Human Rights Council negotiation. And the reason I think Matthews invite me to speak today to show that the issue of human rights defenders has been brought up into the international communities already. And that's why from 2019 resolution, after that 2 years, this side event has been organized by the government, not by the civil society organization. And I think this is the cumulative action from the civil society for the decades to put the pressure to their government to have this kind of resolution, or even the latest council session, the resolution on the rights to the healthy environment is a really important role by the civil society and defenders to put a pressure to the government. And finally, we have the strong resolution, first resolution that recognized environment as the human rights.
And so I like that context. We've had now the resolution from the Human Rights Council on recognizing that there is a human right to a safe, clean and sustainable environment. We're now seeing these resolutions emerge and governments taking on and becoming champions of environmental human rights defenders. So so this is part of that process. I mean, we've seen from Leon that on the ground there's still enormous challenges, and I wanted to then just sort of ask Nick a question, but open it up for other discussion. Is a little bit of the link between making corporations, the investors, responsible for their environmental and human rights violations. And one issue that I do a lot of work in is environment, social and governance issues, which often comes as reporting and looks at climate change. But it seems to me that it could also really start to, if we could link up some of these reporting regimes to some of these violations of human rights and rights of environmental defenders, there could be some movement on investment. And would that be something worthwhile doing. So if I could ask Nick and maybe Leon and Romchat, you might want to comment as well.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. And yeah, I think it's important to recognise what's currently there in terms of what provisions currently exist to protect defenders, both at the international protection mechanisms at the UN or others, but also within businesses themselves as well. So there are a number of attempts to actually improve and strengthen the protection mechanisms that companies themselves, but also international IFIs are actually doing. But we need to continue that. We need to keep pushing that as a collective as well. But we also need to make it clear as well. I feel that as one of our strategies, it identifies it's very important to actually pull down, make it transparent, to actually expose when funds are being channeled and being used to repress human rights defenders working on the environment, and also when profit comes at the expense of local communities being able to just enjoy basic livelihoods. I think with all approaches will need to be multifaceted. Defenders largely on the ground are in constant need of kind of capacity building initiatives, and that is happening in a number of ways, but also increasingly security and criminalization and laws against defenders, not just environmental human rights defenders, but human rights defenders in a number of the countries within this region are increasingly seeing civil society space shrinking. So I hope that's
yes.
helpful.
And I mean, on that, I know we and maybe Leon, I can turn to you. I just also want to say that in terms of that opportunity for peaceful protest shrinking, and this is something that clearly I've learned in the Philippines about red tagging of people who are doing peaceful protests. In Australia, I mean, the Australian governments have often criminalised knitting nannies. These were grandmothers who used to knit things outside of parliamentarians' numbers to raise awareness on climate change, and that was criminalised as being something that was offending or causing pain and harm to the member of parliament outside the office when it was a knitting. So the knitting nannies became criminals, and it was one of those things that seems to have happened in many countries, not just in Southeast Asia. So Leon, would you like to sort of pick up on some of those comments that we made?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
In terms of perhaps the linking of the investment regime with human rights, or ensuring, protecting human rights, not just doing no harm, but actually making it an obligation or a condition of the investment to actually support the environmental and human rights defenders that might be acting against the commercial interests of a company.
Right. So in the Philippines, actually, our regulatory body it's let's say it's schizophrenic. No? It has both the mandate to supposedly protect and regulate industries, but also the mandate to promote the investment of industries to develop and utilize and exploit natural resources. So the Department of Environment and Natural Resources has that conflicted mandate, but more often than not, it actually leans more on the promotion of investment. So you have its bureaus on mining, its bureaus on environmental management, geared more towards approving a lot of foreign investment projects on minerals, on extractives, and actually making an effort to reduce the regulations or the what they call as red tape, but is actually crucial regulations. No? And more often than not, that also includes overriding the most basic procedural rights of land and environmental defense and citizens. So we have a very poor environmental impact assessment system here, where the EIA is treated as a guideline and not as a hard regulation. That compliance is issued even if the EIA is grossly insufficient, because they say that it's just a guideline and they can just improve it along the way. And that is often the starting point. It's the fire starter for more conflicts, because the voices of the marginalized, of the defenders, are not recognized. They are forced to resort to direct action and more confrontational strategies on the ground. And that's the recipe for increased conflict between the state and business, usually collaborating against communities and defenders on the ground. So that's the situation here in the Philippines, and it's prevalent especially in the mining industry, but also increasingly in the softer land grabbing projects such as agribusiness, palm oil plantations here in the Philippines as well. And entire communities are victimized, but entire communities are also silenced as well. No, the reason being most of these conflict areas, as shown in the map I showed earlier, are actually in rural areas and in very far away communities where media and the public has very small access to. So it's really a very vulnerable situation for defenders on the ground, because the problems they face go under the radar. So yeah, it's a growing trend in the Philippines that we really have to address as well.
Thanks. And there's a question from Peter King about, he says, Ukraine, COVID, climate change, biodiversity loss all demonstrate the weakness of global multilateralism. How can we make these global talk fests like the Human Rights Council move towards real action on the ground? I guess, Ramchat, would you like to, in terms of moving towards action, it's some, perhaps some concrete or some further ideas that you think might be worthwhile?
The issue of the human rights defenders and civic space on Ukraine have been discussed in these defenders forum side event as well. And yes, it is the international panel for government to discuss, but I think what can we can make the real implementation on the ground is to follow this development in the international level and share this with the defenders or stakeholders in the region. So that what is going on in Geneva is sounds like it's really far and not really relevant to our work in daily life, but actually it is. So I think the monitoring of this development is the important to make the real implementation of this resolution.
Thank you. And so I'm going to ask, now we have Chanchana Chakma. I'm going to give you the opportunity to unmute yourself, and if you'd like to ask your question or make your comment, please. You're still on mute.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I would like to question to panelists from Philippines, who is from Philippines. Philippines and Chittagong Hill Tracts is similar our environment struggle and self-determination and other. We are struggling here for the protect our environment and Chittagong Hill Tracts and plain land of indigenous people, because our land is the deforestation. Government take a project deforestation, then indigenous land occupied by the multinational company, name of the military camp, name of eco park, name of tourism. That's why we are fighting, and our indigenous people also killed by the military people than other like powerful political powerful people. That's why I would like to say, how do you have like, and do you have international law which is we can protect the environment human rights activists or human rights defender here, because in Chittagong Hill Tracts our struggle is different from plainland in Bangladesh. And like Philippines also, they are struggling. They are, I know the Philippine history, and Chittagong Hill Tracts and Philippine history is similar. That's why I'm asking, because our most of the human rights defender, they are hideout and some are the underground. Then that's why I would like to know that. Do you know that about the international law? How can we protect them?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So, could I answer directly the question? Well, it was addressed to me, I believe.
Yes, yes.
Right? Okay. So yeah, I think from what I understand, the driving question really is how can we make international policies, laws, or resolutions be relevant to the on-ground situation of environmental defenders, especially in similar circumstances where there are historical land and resource conflicts, no? Which serve as roots for the attacks against human rights, especially of the defenders as well. And in our experience, the international human rights system is really a very complex maze that we get lost more often than not. But we had some support really in trying to identify what mechanisms in the United Nations, for instance, can be of practical relevance to actual on-ground situations. So there are a lot, and I can say just one, and maybe Nick and Ramchat can add as well. But we really favor the special procedures mechanisms of the United Nations Human Rights Council, because the independent experts who have the mandates in the special procedures do have some tools at their disposal that can have immediate effects, immediately engage our national governments, for instance, through communications. If we play our cards right, sometimes we're able to facilitate on ground visits by UN experts as well. So the special rapporteurs have this mandate. It's been very difficult during the pandemic, but maybe now that the situation is gradually improving and travel is gradually opening up as well, we can have those possibilities of having special rapporteurs invited by our national governments, especially if we try to demonstrate the what they call this, the invitation as an invitation to look into the environmental concerns, no? Because especially for our countries that are fascist, we have fascist regimes, we have highly militaristic regimes, they're afraid of human rights intervention. So if we try to package, if you will, the special rapporteur intervention as a look or as an investigation into ecosystem situations, invitation into the biodiversity problem, it is easier for government to listen and to possibly invite experts on the ground here in the Philippines. So that's just one example of how you can leverage some of the international mechanisms that we have. But what's important is to always locate these international mechanisms within the national or local campaigns or struggles of the defenders. No? So making sure that these tools reflect what defenders on the ground need to stop a project, to improve their engagement in an environmental impact assessment system. So you have to locate it in the national context always. So yeah.
So
If I may. Thank you so much. So I would like to elaborate more on the question about the international law. So of course we have 93 international human rights treaties, and most government has signed at least one treaty. But in terms of the violation or attack against the human rights defenders. Of course, we have the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and we also that is on the right to life, or the right to judiciary or harassment or arbitrary arrest. And on the defenders, indigenous defenders that you mentioned, we also have the international instrument like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or the law, international law has exist. But in terms of the mechanisms, Leon already mentioned the special procedures, but I will need 1 hour for this session, but there are 3 different mechanisms under the UN system that can support or work on the issue on the attack against human rights defenders. One is the complaint mechanisms under the Human Rights Council. Another one is the UN human rights treaty bodies, like the committees of those treaties. This can also investigate. And Leon also mentioned the special procedures like the special rapporteur or the UN working group or independent expert. And the most relevant special procedures or rapporteur working on these, for example, the special rapporteur on the rights of human rights defenders, the special rapporteurs on the human rights and climate change, and the upcoming one, the climate change, or the working group on the arbitrary detention enforced disappearance. So on the bigger view, we have 3 types of mechanisms, but those mechanisms have some pros and cons and some criteria. So that's why I said I need another 1 hour for only this topic. But the quickest way is to reach out to OSCHR in the region that can also follow up with the mechanism for you, and you can reach out to me. This is the quickest way, and I will leave my email in the chat box after this. But one important thing I would suggest the defenders is the documentation, because the documentation of the incident and everything on the ground is very important for the further action of the mechanism.
And I think, so Nick, I was going to sort of also ask you, because there was a question about, SLAP suits, the suits against strategic litigation against public participation, which, and there was a reference to the Philippine rules of procedure for the Supreme Court of the Philippines, which has a provision which we call an anti-SLAP suit to try and resolve these quasi-legal cases which cause harm or prevent people from being able to exercise their rights to peaceful protest. So maybe I could talk to you, ask you about the SLAP suits and some works there. But I should say, Ramchat, look, that idea of those mechanisms and the need for documentation and reporting is something that I know we've discussed on a number of different occasions, but maybe that is also something that we could look at as a special webinar where we just say, okay, how do we, what information we need, how do we make a complaint, photographs, and we do know many environmental human rights defenders that are in prison or have been subject to false charges, and how can we resolve to protect them. But maybe Nick, I can bring you in and just ask about the issues of those SLAP suits in particular.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. I think particularly in this region, the SLAP suits are one of the main, if not probably one of the main ways of actually targeting defenders. And it often comes out of activism, campaigning, including online campaigning. But it's, in recent research we undertook, it was happening in multiple countries across the region. And it's very much designed to actually prevent defenders from actually continuing their work. In terms of kind of responses to that, how people can and defenders on the ground can actually respond to it. Often these are when they're facing these kind of huge fines and legal charges, it's demoralizing, intimidating, and just simply protecting themselves and those who are targeted takes a lot of resource away from the actual activism work that they are undertaking. There have been some good practices which we've learned, whereby, as you mentioned, anti-SLAPP kind of initiatives, but also counter legal action against companies as well. We've heard of a few instances of that which have been successful. But with that in mind as well, and this kind of comes to the special procedures as well, the different mechanisms to actually highlighting these instances. So the special procedures like the communications, etc., is a resource which can actually put pressure on countries or governments which actually care about their public image, etc. And I think it's just important to emphasize two parts in relation to that. One is, I think, increasingly awareness of the special procedures is something we try to do, and also how to engage with it. Often that involves facilitating communications or other kind of ways, but just general that understanding, that knowledge for those grassroots activists on the ground. But also in regard to SLAPP suits, there are a few things which kind of seem to come out of this, which I feel are a bit of a theme. The first one is legal protection, and it comes to one of the questions there. The legal protection, often activists, particularly grassroots communities and local communities, don't know where they can get support, legal action, whether that's representation or actual financial support for legal fees. The other thing is the mindfulness about how this affects and demoralizes any activism which is being undertaken, and affects the psychosocial well-being of defenders and those being targeted. It's increasingly, we as an organization are trying to increasingly focus on psychosocial well-being and recognition that those being targeted have suffered a great deal. And it's something we really need as organizations, as those supporting defenders on the local level, need to focus on.
Yeah, and I think that psychological cost, and we've seen it a lot of times where people are talking about even just in terms of climate change and other environmental issues, but when you're living it through litigation or court or pressure, these are very, very powerful impact on health and well-being in a real tangible way. And that perhaps brings in, I think one of the comments that Elaine Johnson from the Environmental Defenders Office in Australia has commented in the Q&A that Leon has answered, was talking about the role of Australian lawyers or foreign lawyers, and EarthRights, you are a US as well as a Southeast Asian organization. And I think, Leon, your comment was, Australian lawyers are very valuable because both to maybe, the OECD complaints process is also a way that applies to companies in Japan, Australia, and Korea who are members of the OECD who might be investing here, and using Australian lawyers who are maybe more able to be more familiar with that process, but also bringing cases against Australian or international companies in their home countries, whether it's Rio Tinto or BHP or other mining companies that, or Xstrata and others who, Ankana Gold, for example, in Thailand, who do have Australian connections, and they may be more amenable to litigation in their home country. So the value of networking, I think, is not often explored. There's also a couple of questions. One is about the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People and how that could become more binding law. And there's a comment from Tran Trang about the resolutions of the Human Rights Council not as legally binding, but have political impacts. How does the Human Rights Council, or what does the Human Rights Council do to further make those resolutions more effective at a national level? So I could turn that to Romchat. And then I noticed the time, so very soon I'm going to ask everyone for a couple of minutes as a bit of a summation, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I will quickly address this question about how the Human Rights Council leading to the action. Actually, it's not legally binding, and you mentioned it's like more like the political statement, but in some case, the resolution of the Human Rights Council can also lead to the action that can help address this issue. For example, the resolution can call for the investigations, call for the reports by the UN office or OSCHR or by the officials, or call for the panel discussion or event to allow the debate or sharing of idea, or call for the appointment of the new independent experts or special rapporteurs, or can even develop norms and standards. But you also asked the question about the individual case under the Human Rights Council. As I mentioned, under the Human Rights Council, that is the complaint mechanism, but if we might take some time to answer these questions. So I will leave the link, or maybe Matthew, you can organize a new webinar on this human rights mechanism and defenders again.
That might be an option. I think, I mean, because I do think these are all really key questions, and if there are opportunities that we can use to talk about how we can provide these sort of options, maybe even going through some of the materials so that people are a little bit aware, and this is that capacity building. It's always required. I mean, it's never over. Teaching and training as more people get exposed to environmental human rights defenders and their harms, and no doubt as development pressures increase. And that's something that I've seen in the last 12 years, is that 12 years ago, we could have had a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion with governments about environmental issues and climate change and biodiversity issues. And it wasn't seen as a threat. It was seen as a genuine, important requirement and obligation for society. And I've seen that space, that civic space, shrinking, and now it's very much in terms of environmental and human rights defenders. I've seen a greater concern expressed by them and greater attempts to silence them in protecting something that we now know is so fundamental. And we're facing these triple climate change, biodiversity and pollution crises, and yet that means we need to engage with people. And the environmental and human rights defenders and governments and industry are saying, well, actually that impacts on our business as usual. So maybe we don't want that to continue. So look, I really want to thank our panelists for a very sobering but exciting discussion, and giving you a couple of minutes just to make some concluding statements or thoughts about, maybe next steps or what we do, where we go from here. So Leon, can I open it up to you first for some sort of concluding observations and comments?
Sure, thanks, Matthew. Yeah, and the discussion is really something that I've been looking forward to over the past 2 years, particularly us being able to share our, new but relative to others, a bit deeper experience on engaging international human rights mechanisms for national contexts, especially for more local context. It's a difficult but an important tool to have in your suite of strategies and tactics to defend the environment. And I think it's important to be able to bring these conversations, this capacity building efforts closer to the communities. So being able to translate this into local language, into local experiences as well, is, I think, a key strategy moving forward. And so we look forward to more discussions such as this, to not only have a venue to share about the situation of environmental defenders, but really to answer the question, what is to be done. So thank you.
Thank you. And Nick?
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to kind of emphasize that we work with a lot of environmental defenders, but often we need to realize that technology sort of engagement like this is often not even possible for a lot of those communities that we try to help. And being aware of that, I think one of the most important things, as well as working on the international level and actually supporting initiatives to kind of hold businesses accountable, it's so important to actually support those at the local level, even from the most basic of things like communications, so that they can learn about initiatives, they can learn about forums like this where we can discuss issues, and building that capacity from the ground on up, equipping defenders with these skills, knowledge and tools so that they can also defend themselves, and supporting their initiatives with that. And I just kind of want to end that on the note that whilst there are, many things to be sad about within the region, the inspirational and bravery of a number of defenders throughout the region is really something we should all learn from, and something which, if you've ever been lucky enough to work with local communities, is something that will, give you inspiration and encourage you to continue this great work. So thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And Ramchat, please.
Yes, for the next step, I think this webinar is a really good example of the important role of the network of all the stakeholders to join force and share experience, share information like this. And I have learned a lot from Leon and Nick as well. For OSCHR, our key priorities, of course, is to support the stakeholders in the region and to engage with the UN human rights mechanisms. So this is also my homework that I have to maybe continue working on the capacity building on UN human rights mechanisms. How can the defenders can easily access of those mechanisms? And when Leon said, "Oh, this is very complex mechanism," so yes, this is my big homework. And yeah, we will continue working with the defenders and UN agencies like UNEP on the promotion and protection of human rights defenders in the region.
And I think that's something that we as lawyers also know, that we constantly have to first inform the clients of their rights and then the opportunities to take action and their mechanisms. It's something that it's an ongoing and continuous process of making sure that people understand that they have rights, and more importantly that the law does protect those rights. In most instances in this region, there is a lot of law that protects people. It's just that sometimes the law is then used in ways that clearly was not intended, or maybe it was intended, but certainly when it violates human rights principles, we have to raise that issue. And certainly as lawyers, when it violates our professional obligations, then these are things that we also have to be very aware of. So I would like to thank all our panelists, Leon, Ramchat and Nick, for the wonderful presentations, and we hope to be able to compile the PowerPoints as well as put this on the YouTube, on the Ariel YouTube channel so that we can use this as a resource going forward. I also want to thank our partner organizations, APNED, the Asia Pacific Network for Environmental Defenders, and EarthRights International, who have been great supporters, as well as OHCHR and UNEP, who have really supported all of Ariel's work. LAWASIA, the Law Association for Asia and the Pacific. This is a year of webinars where we're working with LAWASIA to promote environmental law within the Asia Pacific region. The College of Law that is supporting us at the conference, the College of Law Australia, supporting us at the conference and supporting our webinar series, and the Kalikasan People's Network for the Environment for their great work. So thank you all very much. And finally, on behalf of the Asian Research Institute for Environmental Law, I want to thank Colleen and Pum and Pao, who are our team that put on the webinars. I'd also like to invite our participants to stay for a little bit longer. I think, Pum, we're going to be able to show a short 1-minute video about the Environmental Law Conference, the second ASEAN Environmental Law Conference that will be coming up in 2 weeks' time. It's free, it'll be online. You may need a Zoom event or a Zoom account to register, but it's free. We have over 30 speakers over 3 days. We have keynote addresses also from Joanne Carling, who you heard, an amazing Indigenous human rights defender. We have talks on environmental crime and wildlife crime, and we have great talks on environmental defenders, environmental public interest litigation, and some options for the future. And the third day is also a day where we're hoping we've got a number of judicial speakers, and hopefully that will also enable them to link up and hear voices from the region. So thank you very much indeed for all your participation, and certainly to our attendees, without whom the questions and the answers are very, very important for us. So thank you. So Pum, if you are able, we're very happy to see that last minute video, and can I say thank you all very much indeed for your attendance today.